In this lecture, we shall witness the exciting birth of philosophy in the speculations and systems of the PreSocratics. We shall explore how these philosophical forerunners shifted the focus of learned thought from religious questions of who and why to scientific questions of what and how, and, by so doing, kicked off an ongoing dialogue that still continues 2,500 years later. Now, we call them the PreSocratics for two reasons. Number one, they precede Socrates chronologically. But the other, more important reason is that the PreSocratics, and there's about a dozen of them, laid down a philosophical framework that Socrates, and later Plato and Aristotle, both developed and countered. Now, you might ask, when did the PreSocratics live? Well, they cover a span of about 150 years, from 600 BC till about 450 BC. Where did they live? Well, unlike Socrates, who lived in Athens, the PreSocratics hailed first from the Ionian or Asia Minor coast, what today is the western coast of Turkey, and some of the other PreSocratics hailed from the eastern coast of Italy and the island of Sicily. Now, why do I make a point about this geographical aspect? Well, it's vital, I believe, because it places the PreSocratics along major trade routes and thus exposed them to a plethora of foreign ideas and cults. This was particularly true of the founders of PreSocraticism, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, all of whom lived in the Ionian city of Miletus, and therefore we call them the Milesians. They lived again in the western coast of Turkey. Perhaps, I would suggest, growing up in the bustling markets of Miletus, where every conceivable religious system was advocated, inspired these three men, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, to come up with ideas and answers that were more pluralistic, less tied to cultural norms. In other words, they lived in a place that was fertile with new ideas, and I think it inspired them to move beyond tradition and how they grew up and explore new ideas. Now, to guide this new search, this pre-Socratic search, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes formulated a new set of questions. Previous to the pre-Socratics, in the 8th and 7th centuries, Greek poets like Hesiod, he lived about 700 BC, attempted to account for the present state of man and nature by tracing the origins and actions of the gods. In his great work, The Theogony, which means the birth or origin of the gods, Hesiod presents himself as called by the Muses to explain two things. One, why things are as they are, and two, by what divine agency or who these things came into being. In other words, Hesiod is interested in religious questions and supernatural answers. Well, along come the pre-Socratics, along come the Milesians, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, and they reject Hesiod's supernatural religious orientation with its questions of why and who in favor of a more naturalistic, scientific approach. Now, the Greek word for nature is physis, and therefore we call these men physicists or physicists because they're interested in natural, physical, material explanations. You see, their interest, the pre-Socratics, was not in who created the world, but in what the universe was made of. Not in supernatural religious answers or questions, but in material, physical questions. Not who, but what. Likewise, they were interested not in why, but in how things came into being and passed away. They're not looking for philosophical or religious purpose. They're looking for material, physical processes. Again, not how, or excuse me, not why, but how. All right. At first, you might be thinking I'm saying that the pre-Socratics are anti-religious or atheistic. Not necessarily. It's not so much that they're anti-religious as the God or the gods play no significant role in their materialistic systems. Whether or not they believe or not is not important. The questions they're asking are not related to supernatural beings or supernatural forces. Let me explain. Genesis, the Bible, begins with, "In the beginning, God." Well, for the PreSocratics, they posited that the origin of all life is not God, but it is stuff or matter. And what that means is that even if the gods do exist, the gods too are products of this stuff, this primal matter. Do you know what I'm telling you? I'm telling you that the PreSocratics are the true founders of the modern theory of evolution. Evolution was not invented in the 19th century. The PreSocratics were doing it way back 2,500 years ago, looking for physical, material answers to the questions of why we're here and what this earth is made out of. All right, let me tell you a little bit more. All the PreSocratics shared a common belief that the material building blocks of life are composed of and expressed through 4 elements. And I'll bet most of you know earth, air, water, and fire. Now today we know that none of those are elements. Unless you consider air to be pure oxygen, none of them are elements. But the Greeks considered them to be the 4 elements, and they believed that everything in the universe is composed out of a combination of these 4 elements. Now in addition, around these 4 elements, the Greeks posited a long series of qualitative pairs, or pairs of qualities. And those include hot and cold, dry and moist, rare and dense, light and dark, and there are many, many more. And they believed that not only was everything formed of these elements, but everything could be described as either hot or cold, dry or moist. The best way I can give you a feel for what the PreSocratics thought the world was like was to do what they did, and they would mix together the elements with their qualitative pairs. Let me explain. They believed that the universe was composed of 4 levels. The bottommost level was composed of earth, and earth is cold and dry. On top of the earth is a second layer of water, and water is cold and moist. Next is a layer of air, and air is moist, but it's hot. I come from Houston, Texas, where the air is very moist and hot. Finally, the uppermost level is fire, and fire is hot and dry. Again, that will give you a sense of what the PreSocratics thought about their world when they turned their scientific minds towards understanding how the universe worked. All right, with that as our preface, let's go on to look at the PreSocratics themselves. I told you it begins with the Milesians. Another early PreSocratic is Pythagoras, whom we'll talk about in a moment. Both the Milesians and Pythagoras sought to posit a first principle, a single originary substance that could account for the cosmos. Now, the Greek word for this first principle is an arche. Arche, as in archaeology, means beginning or origin. And many of the early PreSocratics wanted to find a single physical origin, a first principle that could be the beginning of everything. Now, the first person to do that was Thales. And therefore, if you look at any book of the history of Western science or the history of Western philosophy, it will always begin with Thales. And by the way, if you haven't noticed, for the PreSocratics, science and philosophy and even religion are the same thing. It's not till Aristotle that we start separating science, philosophy, and religion. Now, before I tell you what Thales' answers was, let me tell you a little bit about Thales. Thales was a keen observer of the natural world. He accurately foretold an eclipse in 585. He measured the pyramids, and he cornered the market on olive presses by predicting a large olive crop. An amazing man. He was considered one of the 7 sages of the ancient world. Now, Thales is actually not totally original. A lot of the techniques that he learned for measuring things actually came from the Egyptians. He visited Egypt, we think, or at least met people who knew Egyptians, and he learned a lot of practical tools from the Egyptians. But what makes Thales, and not the Egyptians, the founder of science and philosophy, is that Thales took ideas that in Egypt were practical and pragmatic. He took those ideas and made them abstract, scientific. He came up with principles rather than just practical techniques. The best way to explain this is to look for a moment at Pythagoras. You all are familiar with the Pythagorean theorem about right triangles. Well, you know, Pythagoras didn't come up with that. He noticed that in Egypt, the Egyptian builders knew that if they had 3 strings, 3 inches, 4 inches, and 5 inches, and they put those strings together, they would get an exact right triangle or 90 degrees. What did Pythagoras do, though? He took that practical thing and he turned it into a theorem. Pythagoras reasoned that in any right triangle, whether small or big, whether on the earth or in the heavens, even if it's a triangle that doesn't exist, in any right triangle, the square of the hypotenuse will always be equal to the sum of the square of the other 2 sides. In other words, again, take practical ideas and turn them into philosophical, scientific theorems. Let's come back now to Thales. Thales, turning his analytical mind towards the nature of the universe, proposed that the first principle of all things is water. Now you may be thinking, what's the big deal? I could have said that. Well, the reason Thales is the founder of science and philosophy in the Western world is not because he chose water as the origin of all things. There's a different reason. The real reason we consider him the founder of philosophy and science is because in so doing, in choosing water, Thales asserted 2 things. 1, that there is an origin, and 2, that that origin could be determined through observation. In other words, Thales set up a scientific technique or approach or method for analyzing and discussing the world. So he is the founder not so much because of his answer, but because of his method. Let's move on. I told you there are 3 Milesians. The next one is Anaximander, and Anaximander was a pupil of Thales. Now, Anaximander did his master one better by pushing the origin, or first principle, backwards, not to water, but to something deeper and more primal than the 4 elements. You see, Anaximander realized that the first principle, the arche, cannot be one of the elements, because if it was one of the elements, it would end up canceling out all the other 3 elements. And not only that, if water is cold and moist, it's going to end up knocking out everything that is dry and hot. So he realized you can't have an element as the first principle or it will control everything. Rather, he said the first element must be something deeper, earlier, more primal. And this something he called the unlimited or the boundless. I would call it a sort of Carl Sagan cosmic soup, out of which the 4 elements and all of nature separated. So Anaximander comes much closer to modern evolution. Right away, he's just at the beginning of science, and he's saying, no, we've got to have some kind of amorphous mass out of which all the elements can separate. Let's move on to the 3rd Milesian, Anaximenes. Now, at first, it might seem that Anaximenes is taking a step backward, because Anaximenes argued that the first principle was air. Now you're probably thinking, didn't he read as Anaximander? Doesn't he know the first element can't be an element? The first principle can't be an element? Well, I think what's going on here is not that Anaximenes is taking a step backward. Anaximenes is interested in something different than Thales and Anaximander. Anaximenes is no longer interested in the what question, but he's interested in the how question. In other words, Anaximenes' real contribution to pre-Socratic philosophy was to offer an explanation not for what the source was, but for how all the elements could be generated out of it. In other words, whatever the first principle is, we've got to answer the question, how can one thing be many things? How can a first principle separate into the 4 elements and move on to make all of matter? Well, Anaximenes had an answer. He starts with air, remember? Anaximenes calculated that by an upward process known as rarefaction, air could transform itself into fire. Likewise, by the opposing process of condensation, air could transform itself to wind, to cloud, to water, to earth, and finally to stone. In other words, by one of those two processes, either rarefaction going upward or condensation going downward, one element could literally turn into all the elements. So again, he answers the how question, the question of process. Now, hindsight suggests that Anaximenes would have been done better to stick with Thales and water. Think about it. Water exists as three elements, doesn't it? Ice, water, and steam. It also exists as three substances: solid, liquid, gas. So it would have been much better to explain rarefaction and condensation using water, but he used air. Again, hindsight is everything. All right, that's the Milesians. Let us move on now to Pythagoras, a name that you all recognize and are probably interested to hear about. Pythagoras was also a pre-Socratic, also was interested in a first principle, but Pythagoras offered a more elaborate, quasi-religious solution to the problem of origin. He suggested that the real origin of everything is numbers, or as Pythagoras said, all is number. Now, many of you know that Pythagoras was one of the first people to note a direct relationship between numerical ratios and the harmonies of music. In other words, he found that there are certain ratios, mathematically speaking, that create certain chords, or octaves, or fifths, or thirds. And of course, Pythagoras was not only a mathematician, but a musician. But what many people don't realize is that Pythagoras did not stop there. He reasoned that just as numbers undergird music, so are they the very stuff and pattern of the universe. In other words, he believed that beneath everything in the cosmos was some kind of a numerical ratio. Isn't that a wonderful image? Indeed, Pythagoras' faith that the whole natural world must display numerical order was so strong, so firm, that he would often indulge in great leaps of logic to accommodate his, quote, conspiracy theory view of nature and numbers. Let me explain. When Pythagoras looked up in the heavens, he noticed or observed that there are 9 heavenly bodies, or 9 spheres, 9 planets that revolve. But that wasn't good enough for Pythagoras, because you see, Pythagoras and his followers considered the number 10 to be a mystical, almost magical number. They would often arrange it like bowling pins. They considered 10 a sacred number. And so you can't have 9. And so you know what Pythagoras did? He very unscientifically posited a 10th sphere that he called the counter-earth. You can't see it, but it's got to be there, because you have to have 10 spheres, because 10 is the magic number. All right, many of you know, though, that Pythagoras was also a religious leader. How do we move from math and numbers to religion? Let me explain. Pythagoras believed that as those 10 planets, those 10 spheres, revolved in the cosmos, they rubbed against each other and produced a beautiful celestial music known as the music of the spheres. But our physical, dirty, so to speak, ear cannot hear that music. The only way you can hear that celestial music is if you purify your body, mind, and soul. And so Pythagoras founded a religious cult that young men gravitated around him, and they wanted to be initiates in his cult, and they wanted to learn and practice spiritual disciplines that would so purify their body, mind, and soul as to allow them to hear that beautiful music of the spheres. Now let's go another step. Pythagoras believed in reincarnation. He believed the soul was immortal, and he believed that until the soul achieved an inner harmony or attunement to the greater harmonies of the cosmos, it would be doomed to return to earth in a series of incarnations. In other words, he believed the soul would come back again and again until the soul reached a state of perfection. And for Pythagoras, that state of perfection was a kind of mathematical harmony. It's when my soul is attuned to the soul, if you will, of the cosmos. When I not only hear the music of the spheres, but enter into it, that's when I'm ready to leave behind the earth and all of its physical matter and ascend to the heavens. Wow. Pythagoras' system combines philosophy, religion, and science, and so he has had a profound influence in all of those fields. Let me just give you an example. First of all, Pythagoras paved the way for Plato's theories of the transmigration of the soul. He learned that idea, Plato did, from Pythagoras. Also, the Middle Age obsession with numbers goes back to Pythagoras. Dante's Divine Comedy is obsessed with numbers. Finally, Galileo's claim that math is the language of the universe is pure Pythagoras. All right, so far we've seen how Pythagoras and the Milesian answer the questions of what and how. But the later PreSocratics had another related question, and that question was, is the true nature of reality singular or plural? Fixed or changing? And in the end of my lecture, I'm going to look at one pre-Socratic named Heraclitus, who believed it was changing. And then I'm going to look at two pre-Socratics, Parmenides and Zeno, both of whom came from Ilia, Italy, and are therefore known as the Eleatics. And the Eleatics believed that the nature of the world was fixed. Let's begin with Heraclitus. Heraclitus possessed one of the richest, most enigmatic intellects of the ancient world. All of his speculations were recorded in cryptic aphorisms that have influenced such thinkers as Blake, Nietzsche, and T.S. Eliot. Still, Heraclitus' basic theory is clear and is best expressed in his well-known saying, "You can never step in the same river twice." In other words, Heraclitus believed that all of nature is in constant flux. Every time you go to a river, it's a new river because it's continually changing. Indeed, according to Heraclitus, the only constant in the universe is change itself. He believed that a perpetual yet creative strife existed between the elements and their qualitative pairs. Heraclitus had this view of the cosmos as engaging in a universal dance, one element becoming another element, one pair becoming another pair. This wonderful, beautiful image of ceaseless change. Heraclitus often used the twin images of the bow and the lyre to express how harmony can arise out of opposing, seemingly destructive forces. Think about the way a bow bends. The bend of the bow should snap it, but the bend of the bow gives the string the proper tension to send the arrow flying. Likewise, the bend of the lyre allows it to produce its beautiful harmony. And so everything is change, and stability is actually based on unending change. All right, to most of you, that sounds intuitive. Of course, everything's changing. Let's look now, though, at the Eleatics, beginning with a philosopher named Parmenides. Unlike Heraclitus, Parmenides argued that the nature of reality is actually one and unchanging, the opposite of Heraclitus. You'll recall a moment ago that I told you in the Theogony, Hesiod imagined himself as called by the Muses. Well, in what may be a parody of Hesiod, Parmenides presents himself in his work as called by the goddess of truth to discern between two things, true knowledge and mere opinion. What's the difference? True knowledge, Parmenides argued, rests on nature, and it is apprehended by speculative reason. Opinion, on the other hand, rests on custom and is perceived by the senses. Nature, or physis, is something fixed and unchanging, Parmenides believed, and our reason apprehends that fixity, that eternality. Custom, on the other hand, what the Greeks called nomos, custom is always changing, and our senses are beguiled by the changing of custom. So it's a break between knowledge and opinion, physis and nomos, reason and the senses. Now, Parmenides argued, while opinion tells us that things change and move, reason dictates that this is an illusion. Parmenides is counterintuitive and hard to understand because he says, even though our senses tell us everything changes, our reason tells us that everything is one. Parmenides argued two things. One, that being is perfect and complete and therefore cannot change. He believed being was in a perfect state and it can't change because it would get less or worse. Being is perfect. Number two, he argued that non-being does not exist. There's no such thing as nothing. There's no such thing as the void. And therefore, if there's no non-being, that means there's no empty space in the universe for being to move around in. He believed that the universe was made basically of one mass, a mass that was eternal and perfect and complete. And therefore, his system is known as monism. Everything is one. Everything is a mass. Heraclitus, on the other hand, believed in pluralism, that there are many things and that those things change ceaselessly and eternally. Finally, I mentioned that being is perfect and complete. Let me explain why being is eternal. Parmenides said being must be eternal, for if at a certain point it came into being, then it could only have sprung out of not being, and not being does not exist. In other words, for Parmenides and the Eleatics, nothing can come out of nothing. If being exists, it must have always existed. Perfect, unchanging, eternal. Now, again, that's counterintuitive. And as you can imagine, Parmenides' contemporaries ridiculed his ideas. They said, Parmenides, are you blind? Can't you see that there are many things that they change? Well, Parmenides is counterintuitive. And he had a wonderful pupil named Zeno. And Zeno rose up and defended the monism of his master from ridicule. But he did it in a very unique and interesting way. Zeno defended monism from ridicule by demonstrating in a series of paradoxes that a belief in change, pluralism, when taken to its logical endpoint, yields results that are more ridiculous. Now, this method of attacking philosophical positions by exposing their latent absurdities is known as reductio ad absurdum. In other words, if you want to explode your opponent's theories, you take them and reduce them to their endpoint and show that that endpoint is absurd. That's a method that's still used today. Let me explain. In his best-known paradox, Zeno exposes the self-contradictory nature of movement by proving that Achilles, though twice as swift, could never catch an opponent that was given even a 10-foot head start. Let me explain. Achilles is here. His opponent is 10 feet in front of him. The judge says go. Achilles runs 10 feet. But by the time he gets to his opponent has run 5 feet. So Achilles runs 5 more feet, but now his opponent is 2.5 feet in front of him. And so on, reductio ad absurdum. Now, you can probably poke holes in that, but what Zeno is saying is, if you believe in change and movement, you're going to end up with a ridiculous conclusion that Achilles will never catch his opponent. That's ridiculous. Of course he will. He's twice as fast. But if you believe in movement, then you have to come up with this paradoxical or ridiculous answer. Again, most of us can poke holes in that, and many have, but it was very, very influential. And again, the whole method of reductio ad absurdum is used often in philosophy, even today. Now, this impasse, this philosophical impasse between Heraclitus the pluralist and the Eleatics, who were monists, sort of sent shockwaves throughout Western philosophy. And indeed, the remaining PreSocratics, and even people after them, set as their goal the attempt to reconcile change and continuity, pluralism and monism, Heraclitus and the Eleatics. And indeed, the remaining major PreSocratics, Empedocles, Anaxagoras, Democritus, and Leucippus, and alas, I have no more time to tell you about them, but if you get a chance to read them, look for what they're doing. They are trying to reconcile change and continuity. But let me end with the important man, and that is Plato. Because Plato, I believe, came up with the fullest and best answer to this pre-Socratic riddle. Plato said the reason why we have monism and pluralism is that we actually have two worlds. Up there in the heavens is the world of being, and that world is eternal and perfect and unchanging. That is the world of monism, and that world can only be perceived by the speculative reason. On the other hand, Plato argued, our world is the world of becoming, and our world is pluralistic. It changes, it decays, and it dies. And our world is perceived by the senses. And Plato believed that our senses fool us, that the only true knowledge is the knowledge of the world of being. And so Plato caps off the PreSocratics by coming up with the perfect way to reconcile monism and pluralism.